Oh, hello there. Don't mind me. I'm sorry for the delay in new horror reviews. I've been a tiny bit delayed by really not being very good at making them. And also I moved house. That was a thing. And one of the things I did to celebrate moving house was reach back into what I consider the big names, the horror canon. And for me as a Gen Xer, that's things you've probably still heard of. Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, Hellraiser, and of course Friday the 13th. If you're a Zoomer, it's probably Saw, the Conjuring series, Paranormal Activity, yeah, those. Now I find it kind of interesting because I love the big canon films because for me they're kind of like the architecture of horror culture.
You?
Not at all.
You're going to Camp Blood, ain't you?
God damn it, Ralph, get out of here. Go on, get. Leave people alone.
You'll never come back again.
Oh, shut up, Ralph.
It's got a death curse.
Look, if you've watched enough of these videos, you know I'm going to throw in pretentious crap, okay? Bear with me, they're the architecture of horror culture, right? And the one I was most interested in looking at was Friday the 13th. I'm a fair way into the series. I've seen definitely the later ones, and I've seen from the beginning quite far in. And what I find interesting about Friday the 13th and the idea of watching Friday the 13th if you've not really got much experience with horror. So like the paradox for me is that Friday the 13th is a really big name in horror and it's also massively misunderstood. Okay, so to illustrate what I mean by that, when I said Friday the 13th, what came into your mind? Like if I said Nightmare on Elm Street, you're thinking probably Freddy Krueger, the red and green striped jumper and the knives for fingernails, right? So when I say Friday the 13th, what are the images that come into your head? What for you is in a Friday the 13th film? Just take a minute and look at this entirely randomly selected footage. Cool. So you're probably thinking Jason Voorhees, hockey mask, machete, summer camp, right? But the thing is, if you just start from the beginning, you're wrong.
Please stop!
Name the killer in Friday the 13th.
Jason! Jason! Jason!
I'm sorry, that's the wrong answer.
No, it's not! No, it's not! It was Jason!
Afraid not? No way.
Listen, it was Jason! I saw that movie 20 goddamn times!
Then you should know Jason's mother, Mrs. Voorhees, was the original killer. Jason didn't show up until the sequel. I'm afraid that was a wrong answer.
You tricked me.
Within the horror fandom, you know, it's well known enough to be mentioned in Scream. So obviously, point one, Jason is not the killer in the Friday the 13th movies. Not in the first one, not in the fifth one. Jason doesn't get the iconic outfit until film 3. Obviously, he wasn't in part 1. If you watch part 2, Jason's first appearance, he's wearing a very fetching plaid shirt and hemp gimp mask. It's, look, we're all very glad for the hockey mask, okay? If you're thinking summer camps, about half the movies do not take place in or around any summer camps at all. Jason Taking Manhattan is a very obvious example of that. And the other most important thing to point out is that for this big name in horror film, you're possibly thinking that Friday the 13th, the first one, is good. No. So I'm pointing this out because for me it's really interesting that Friday the 13th, for being this big name in the horror canon, does not arrive fully formed, that the images you have in your mind are not there in the first film, not there in the second, and really aren't there in any single film. That's because when Friday the 13th started out, it's an innovation. Now, of course, it's not completely groundbreaking, like slasher films have their roots in Italian giallo films, and the director is very frank that he was inspired by Halloween when it came out in 1978. He wanted that slasher aesthetic, and he wanted to build it into his own movie. And the thing about innovation is that it tends to not produce the finished product, even if it's really interesting. Like when I watched Seinfeld, I felt like I was watching a half-formed Friends. Sorry to any fans of that show, it's just that's the impression I had. Watching Friday the 13th, it was like this really iconic idea was almost there, but still missing so much. Now, of course, the other thing to bear in mind about horror films, and especially horror films in the early 80s, although this is really true of everything pushed out by Blumhouse Productions at the moment, is horror films are really cheap to make. That's why so many directors, so many young actors get a start in them. They can be absolutely churned out. And the Friday the 13th films were churned out.
There's everything here, all the mail, entertainment cassettes, a new batch of movies.
Yo, the new Friday the 13th movie? Friday the 13th, part 1649?
The first one was insanely profitable, and immediately there was a call to make the next one. So you've got these films that are being produced essentially en masse, with a fairly loose template and lots of different hands touching the project in terms of directors, writers, producers. That means that around this essential framework, you're getting lots of different ideas in the mix, i.e. there's experimentation. And some of the good ideas stay, like the hockey mask, and ones like the jute gimp mask go. There's all this experimentation in the series, elements being added, elements being removed. So we get the hockey mask, that's iconic, that totally works. Summer camps, that works pretty well, we'll do that a fair amount. The outfit, the machete, they all stay. And the series, and us as the audience, forgets about other elements like Pamela Voorhees, psychics, the jute gimp mask, rednecks trying to go to Manhattan on a ferry, things like that.
You're a dead meat slime bag! Yo, man, it's cool. It's cool, man. It's cool.
So you have this weird effect where in this fairly incoherent series, from all these elements, essentially there's a natural selection for the ideas, and from this we get the meme of Friday the 13th. That's essentially true of the series as a whole, but you're really not going to find it in any individual movie. It's kind of what I find interesting. Now, for what I've watched, this holds true, and admittedly some of it has been rough going. Look, I'm a big proponent of horror, okay? I love this stuff, but mass-produced sequels to slashers in the 80s, you know, it can be a labor of love. They can be hit and miss, even if I found some stuff to love in all of them. There are 12 Friday the 13th movies, and the quality is not unvarying. Although, in the series' favour, it did take Jason 10 films to go into space. And, the Leprechaun series managed that in 4. It's not the most solid measure of a series quality, but I think it's something we can work with. So obviously I am super biased. I'm always going to encourage you to give horror films a go, and especially big canon horror series, because even if they are not the highest quality, I do think they are interesting culturally. So I suppose that raises the question of, if you want to see Friday the 13th, how do you go about that? Well, an obvious place to start is, of course, the first one, the best rated on Rotten Tomatoes, which I massively dispute. It is not bad. It will be interesting to see the sort of bare bones structure of the Friday the 13th series. A really young Kevin Bacon, of course, and some fantastic effects work by Tom Savini.
Thank you.
But the first one has some massive flaws, really massive flaws. The final confrontation with the killer is terrible. It's just terrible. Essentially, our final girl finds out who the killer is and beats her and runs away and hides, and is found and beats her and runs away and hides. And we repeat this to cover 21 minutes in order to reach feature length. This is a problem. If you can get past the pacing issues, it is worth seeing. There are some small changes made in part 2, not enough that particularly interests me, but for my money, part 3 is when we start to see a really strong entry into the series. There's some variety, so it's not all in the summer camp setting. We get the iconic mask and iconic outfit being picked up, and the series seems to know a little more what works at this point. I also really enjoyed some of the more subversive, disturbing elements of part 4, including a really good performance for my money by Corey Feldman. But one weird outcome of the series essentially finding itself in bits and pieces over the course of 9 films is that, for my money, the best entry in the series is actually the Platinum Dunes remake. Look, I don't praise Platinum Dunes lightly. I know what I'm doing here. I do feel bad for it. But credit where credit's due, the Platinum Dunes took the best of everything that came out of those 9 films and produced what I think is a really solid Friday the 13th movie.
Did you know a young boy drowned here?
Essentially a distillation of it. They separated the wheat from the chaff and produced a very streamlined, effective horror that does, to me, feel a lot like a Friday the 13th movie. I'm going to drop in a fairly major spoiler at this point, so if you want to enjoy the 2009 Friday the 13th remake unspoiled, then you should just skip to the time that's on the screen at the moment. If you don't care about that, then I'm going to drop one of my favourite things about the 2009 remake, and that is, it does what I call the death proof. It's a plot device that I really don't see anywhere else. I mean, you can think of it as a scaled up version of the big twist in Psycho. The film starts off with what we expect are campers coming into the summer camp, and we spend just enough time with them to get them established for us to think that these are the people we're going to spend the whole movie with. And then they encounter Jason and they are offed. Now, a similar thing happened in Death Proof, but Death Proof took about 45 minutes to do that. And so when it happens and we then start with a new group of characters, the feeling I had was kind of not again. Whereas Friday the 13th gave just enough time to set up some elements that would come in later in the film, but not for me to feel, oh gosh, we're just repeating it, you know? So for me, that was really smart pacing, really good filmmaking, and established this new Jason as a threat really early on. I would really recommend it. It feels heretical to say that a remake, especially one by Platinum Dunes, is the best of the lot, but sorry, there it is. If you've got a little more time on your hands and you fancy delving deeper into the series, I would say definitely watch 1, grimace, get through it, acknowledge the flaws, but also acknowledge what it led to. Skip 2, definitely give 3 and 4 a watch. Definitely watch the remake. And if you have that much extra time on your hands and you want to see Jason Voorhees in space, yeah, Jason X. Do it. Do it.
Cutting everybody down, real horror show.